Hello, everyone. Welcome to You Thought You Knew, the podcast where we talk about Survivor players that we think may be underrated, underappreciated, or just misunderstood. Each episode, we'll try to answer a question that's designed to make us challenge our preconceived notions about a famous Survivor contestant. And of course, there are no right answers. This is just a way for us to talk about our favorite show. I'm your co-host, Nigel Bocanegra, and as always, I am joined by my partner, Kevin McLain.
Yes, and I'm really excited for today's episode because, when we pitched this idea to Rob and suggested all these different characters and legends to talk about, and you could have an opportunity to challenge these notions in the discourse that have lived on for years. Susie was definitely the least flashy person on that list, but that was the person Rob was the most excited to hear about because he was like, no one ever talks about Susie. And I'm like, well, buckle up because I can talk about Susie for a while. So I'm really excited. And I think we can kind of just start jumping into it. Susie Smith's performance in Survivor Gabon shocked viewers at multiple turns. From being selected early on in the tribe pick'em to changing the game's trajectory by booting Marcus to being only one vote shy of winning the entire season, Susie Smith was a significant factor in both the story and strategy of one of Survivor's messiest seasons. Far before the diversity initiatives of modern Survivor, Susie was only the second Latina to ever make it to the finals, but her edit was severely minimized and her placement was quite often criticized as being undeserving. But this is a person that has won more immunity challenges than James Clement, won more jury votes than Stephen Fishbach, and was on the correct side of every single vote. So why did jurors, fans, and production alike dismiss this quiet legend? Well, you thought you knew Susie Smith? Well, we hope we really do. And today we'll be asking the question, was Susie Smith robbed?
Today, we are joined by a guest who, just like Kevin and myself, is also a Gabon fanatic. Please welcome Maggie Morgan. Maggie, how are you?
Hi, guys. I'm doing great. I feel like I'm the only person other than you two on the RHAP network who is brave enough to talk about Gabon twice here. That's how you know I'm committed. I'm going to do hours-long podcasts about Gabon twice. So, I'm great. I'm excited to talk about our subject today. I have a lot of opinions. I'm excited. I loved the podcast that you guys did with Colleen with Rob. I'm really excited to get to be a part of the series. And I love this question of, was Susie robbed? Because I have feelings.
Yeah, I have so many feelings. And I just feel like Gabon is a season, maybe we're the only ones who want to talk about it so much, but Gabon is a season that really holds up on rewatch. I feel like it gets better every time you watch it in a way that there's a lot of really popular seasons of Survivor that don't do that at all. I think quite often it only works the first time. But Gabon, there's so many little pieces and little gems. And I feel like Susie Smith's actually kind of one of them, despite being a very unflashy person herself.
And, I love Gabon because it's, in my opinion, so character focused. I think, there are plenty of seasons out there that have really innovative, flashy, exciting gameplay. And I think commentary you hear often about Gabon is that it's not good gameplay. Ultimately, I don't care if it's good gameplay or not. I'm here to be entertained. That's what I think allows the season to be truly rewatchable, even though you know what strategic moves may be coming. And I think that Gabon really delivers on all of the entertainment factor from start to finish.
I think so. And Maggie, I'm actually very interested, since you are a Gabon fan, and I think for a lot of people, they kind of write Gabon off. What do you think is the story of Gabon, actually? How do you think about, why is it worth watching even?
Okay, so I feel like I said this before we started. If you are watching Survivor because you want to watch a heroic superhero, you want to watch the protagonist win, then this is not the season for you. But if you're somebody who likes camp, who has a great sense of humor, who, perhaps really wants to go see that new horror film, Megan, who enjoys the Real Housewives. If that's your type of reality television, Gabon has everything. And, Gabon to me is it's very much, when I watch reality TV, I don't necessarily want to watch somebody that I like am like, oh yeah, this person is just like my best friend. Like those people are fun, but the people that I derive the most joy from on reality TV are when I'm watching and all I can think of is where on earth did casting find these people? Like where are they from? What corner of the world did they get plucked from to come on my screen? Because I've never seen anyone who actually acts like this in real life. Like Coach is a great example. When Coach came on my screen in Tocantins, I was like, this is now we're cooking with gas. Like, this is what I want. And I mean, this season has it all. That you have Sugar, who is the driving force of strategy on Gabon. Love her or hate her, she is the one who is driving the season fully. You have Crystal Cox, one of my favorite Survivor players of all time. The funniest, unintentionally funny player that there has ever been. Susie, who is the most regular person you will ever see on your television screen, to the point where you're like, why is she here? What's going on? How did she make it through casting? Like, what did they talk about with her? And yet there she is, just being completely regular out on Earth's last Eden. Like it's so good. It's mwah, it's just so good.
Yeah, I love that, and I've always described Gabon as like, it's like if Mad TV made Survivor, you know, like it's like tropes and like characters, and they're just so exciting and dynamic and opinionated and vindictive. I mean, these are people who really feel every single like emotion, and I just like I'm here for the roller coaster that is. And I think there's power shifts, there are underdogs, there's like incredible challenge performances, innovative strategy. I think it has it all, but I think maybe it's just not in the package most people are used to consuming Survivor. But it's like sometimes you just want something a little bit more fun, and I think Gabon is like one of the most fun seasons of all time. And if you like fun, if you love irony, if you love camp, then I think Gabon is something that you should watch every year because it's truly perfect.
So Maggie, our question today, is talking about whether or not Susie is robbed. Do you tend to like the robbed contestants on Survivor?
So I think that in order to talk about this, we have to define what being robbed is. And I have a lot of feelings about what it is to be robbed. And I think that there's three types of people that you would consider robbed. I think the only people that I personally, me as Maggie, you can have a different opinion than me. I welcome it. Me as Maggie, the only person that I truly feel like is robbed on Survivor is somebody who's taken out before they make it to tribal council in a way that was grossly unfair to them. So Suri Fields is a great example of this. Like she got robbed 3 of the 4 times she played.
I'd say 4.
Sure,
every time.
She got voted out fair and square on Heroes Villains though, but like, the advantage get-in, it has to make this fire in Panama. This is the first time they're doing that. She has to, and then obviously they were supposed to have the final 3 in Micronesia. Somebody even like Jesse, who goes out this past season on a fire making challenge, which is this new thing in the new-ish concept in the game that's not what Survivor was built on, which is everybody voting each other out. It's like you go home from a challenge performance. Those are the people that I personally consider robbed. Then you have the people who sit in front of a jury and you feel like they are playing a game that is worthy of winning. People like Parvati in Heroes Villains. She played a game that I personally think was absolutely worth a title. She did not get the title because other people voted for somebody else. I personally don't consider that robbed because people were able to vote for her, which is a major function of the game at the end, and she was not able to pull it out. Then you have people like Susie, who a lot of people consider robbed, who a lot of people would not say played a winning, like was playing a game of Survivor that like is overall considered to be a winning game. But she was probably the best player out of those final 3 contestants. So you're like, well, she played the best out of these 3 people, even if the game wasn't amazing, she's robbed. The thing that I have to say about that is that we've seen players like that, players in that Susie position, have a social game that carries them through to the win. I actually feel like a great counterpart for Susie is somebody like Sandra, somebody like Erica from 41, somebody whose game was very unflashy, was very much a very passive game, sort of like you make one move and then sort of sit back, let other people play around you, weasel your way to the end. But those people had the social game to back up their win. They had the social capital to get people to vote for them to win. Susie was a player who almost was there, but was not able to pull out the win by a vote from a jury of her peers, which is why I do not consider Susie to be robbed.
Yes, and I think that's like a fair assessment. I kind of like the way that you broke it down between these different levels of
Mhm.
being robbed. Like, I think it's like Susie can be talked about being robbed because I think for some, observers, and me being one of them,
Mhm.
I would have voted for Susie because I felt like she was the most self-interested player in the final three. When you have Sugar who didn't care about winning, and Bob who said he didn't outwit, outplay, or outlast really any of them, it's hard for me
Mhm.
not to vote for anyone else. So it's like, in many ways, in my heart, Susie's robbed, but maybe she was like pickpocketed. She wasn't robbed.
Mhm. Mhm.
She was inconvenienced. Like it's unfortunate, but as a game player, I don't think Susie was robbed because I think she was willing to go to the end with Maddie, who she would have lost to by a bigger margin, right? So like, it's not as
Mhm.
if Susie was this like incredible player. So I don't know if I'd say Susie was robbed as much as I do think she's like a robbed goddess, which is technically a different subset of what it means to be
Uh-huh.
robbed, right? And I think this is a term that came popular on Survivor Sucks, but like it's usually like a late game female contestants that have like a very strong fan base, even if it's like a small one, but very vocal. And to me, like Susie was really robbed of like a reception, of an edit, of any of analysis, because they really gave her
Sure.
such little footage. And so to me, like, while Susie was not robbed of a win, I think she was robbed of like, if there's a world where because I believe every single winner deserves their win. I think that's the whole like kind of concept of Survivor. I can't really deny that, even if I wouldn't have voted
Mhm.
for them. But like, if
Mhm.
we know there's a world where people talk about like X, Y, and Z were robbed, I think Susie should probably talk to more about in that same camp of people than she is. And I think a reason why that doesn't often happen is because people didn't have a lot to latch onto with Susie. But I think if you kind of sift through the footage, you really want to kind of talk it out and see all the other factors that played along in the Gabon experience and Susie's trajectory. I think it's the most exciting timeline to live in, is the one that where you can kind of like buy in and give Susie the benefit of the doubt and think of her as robbed. So she's like, it's like I find her just very interesting.
Maggie, I really like the three categories that you kind of laid out
Mhm.
for us as to what can qualify someone as robbed. I would like to introduce a fourth category that's
Ooh.
mostly centered around delusion, where it's, awareness that like I don't think that people will look at this person as robbed, but they were robbed to me because, deep in
Mhm.
your heart, it's like I cannot accept that this
Sure.
person was not, given their due, even though all of the evidence in front of you
Yeah.
is really telling you that you are wrong. It's like they're robbed in
Mhm.
my heart
Yeah.
only.
Maggie, do you have anyone that's like that, like a pre-merger that you think of like, oh, they were not robbed by any real metric, but to me, they will always be robbed? Is there anyone that comes to your
Oh,
mind?
oh
There's so many people.
gosh. I know. No, because when I was thinking this through today, I was thinking like, okay, who do I really consider to be robbed? I think that my approach to watching Survivor, because I'm such a Big Brother girl, I think that my approach to watching Survivor is perhaps different than a lot of people who watch it, because I really feel like if you like there is more than one way to win Survivor, obviously. But I feel like if you are going to be the strongest strategy to win Survivor is passive gameplay. That most of the time is going to get you the win on Survivor just by game mechanics. But passive gameplay does not lend itself to great television presence, and it does not lend itself to honestly sometimes great final tribal performance, which is why a lot of people who are passive game players, who people consider to be robbed goddesses, do not win the game. But then you have people like Sandra, people like Michelle, who play passively, but they are so dynamic. They are great, so great socially that the people watching are like, oh my God, this person is amazing. And the people out there are like, oh my God, this person is amazing. And I think that for me, like the people who I consider to be robbed are people like Suri, people like Jesse, people like Michelle on Fiji, who just got totally twist screwed. Like, these are people who played perfectly, and then something completely out of their control came in and swooped in and was like, no, you're out of here. Those are the people that I really consider to be robbed.
Yeah, you're very selective. It seems like with
I
robbed,
am.
which is very different than how Twitter quite often engages with the word robbed. It's like there's always at least
Totally.
5 people robbed every single year, and it's always Justine. You know, it's always someone who goes out second or
A
something.
pre-merger that you can perfectly explain why they went home. It's like, they were robbed, weren't they?
Yeah. But that's kind of the
it's
fun.
it's someone though, like, I think somebody like Omer is a really great example of this from 42, where like I think a lot of people would say Omer was robbed. You know, Omer was the best player of the season, Omer was robbed. But Omer got removed from the game fair and square with normal game mechanics by the person who won the game. So by that, like, I don't think Omer was robbed. I think Omer was outplayed, you know?
Yeah.
And I do think like that is a big thing for me. Most of the people who I think are robbed are, you know, removed from the game by something out of their control. And I do really feel like if you make it to the end and the jury does not vote for you, like, that is, since the very first season of Survivor, that's the only thing you had to do, is get the jury to vote for you, whatever way you do it, you know? So we can talk through, you know, the reasons that people get robbed, which I do think are the reasons why people don't win or are considered robbed, which I do think are very nuanced and have a lot to do with, you know, social dynamics and maybe the way that people see people in the world and in general. But I think that overall, I'm going to stay selective and say my only true robbed player on Survivor is Suri Fields.
Yeah, and I think that's like that's a vision I want. I also tend to like lean on, is like there are really not that many people who are robbed, but I will, you know, stick my neck out there and say that I do think Susie was really if you're someone who uses the word robbed frequently, I feel like Susie should be more in your vocabulary, just because it's like, if you think Justine was robbed, then I think you should think Susie was robbed. Like, if that's the barometer you're using, you know, like, why not Susie? I think like on paper, she has like a case. I don't think she's particularly good at telling it. I don't think the producers are particularly good at telling it. But I think that's also kind of the fun in being part of a community that gets to dissect and analyze and critique the footage that's being given to us and the stories that are being given to us.
Yeah, and you know, it's so funny. When I watched Gabon for the first time, I watched Survivor 1 through 20 all in order. And I watched Gabon, and we were at the finale, and I watched all of the seasons unspoiled. Like, I went into every finale not knowing who won. And I was watching the finale, and I texted my friend and said, "Oh my God, is Susie about to win the season? Like, are you kidding me?" Because the story is just so under edited. The story is so, and I think that the problem for Susie is that she makes her move early, you know, like right at the merge, you know, when they split off into those two tribes. She's part of the people who votes out Marcus. She flips, and then she rides it out, right? And then she plays passively, which, if you're looking at regular Survivor game mechanics, that's the way to do it. The problem is she pissed off this very entitled alliance who really felt super strongly that they were the good guys and the other people were the bad guys. And she didn't have the social dynamics to figure out how to flip it back the other way. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I mean,
and that, go ahead.
No, I think what you're saying is like, for a lot of people is very surprising, because I did not watch Survivor Gabon's finale live. It was like, so after Crystal got voted off, I need to take a break. I can't handle being hurt again, because I was so in the tank for Crystal. And so I didn't watch the finale. I just, you know, I think I had a swim meet or something the day that it occurred. But I remember at lunch the next day, someone was telling me what happened, and they go, and Susie, like, Bob got 4 votes and Susie got 3, and I go, Susie got 3 votes. Oh, legend. Like, that's came out of my mouth. I go, I would have voted for her. And I just, like, as soon as I think Crystal and Kenny, because I really, as much as I think people also give Sugar a lot of credit for driving the game, I've always been more in the Crystal Kenny camp of that. And I think Susie's such a Crystal Kenny, like, warrior, and like their insert into the final 3. I mean, Susie's the one that kind of blows up Sugar's dream final three in a way by like depriving her of her end game goal, which is like to me another check. Like Susie exists to like wreak havoc on all these other people who I think are a bit entitled. Like the onions are want her to accept her position in the game and just lie down, and she unravels them. She turns on Crystal and Kenny when she sees the tide going against them, and then she by winning immunity pushes back against Sugar's preferred final three. So it's like, I think it's just such an interesting figure despite not being the most like interesting like person. And I think maybe to like what Maggie was saying earlier, I can't sit here and say that Susie Smith was some incredible game player or even a very compelling character, but I think she's an interesting survivor figure because like for all intents and purposes, Susie should have never been put on Survivor, right? Like she's not particularly charismatic or athletic or introspective or wise or any of these things. She's kind of just like a nice, like she's like a neat lady, she's like a nice mom who's like kind of lame. Like she's kind of maybe boring to like the people around her. They don't really enjoy her company, but she went on Survivor. She gets on despite having really no business being there, gets all the way to the final three, is one vote away from winning. And that's iconic behavior. I don't care what you say. Like that's ridiculous to me. And I love the fact that someone like Susie Smith could almost win Survivor. I think a lot of people use that as a knock against Gabon, but I love the idea that Susie could win Survivor because I love the idea that anyone could win Survivor because I'm really kind of, committed to this core concept of the show, which is that, you take all these different people from different walks of life and, as long as they survive the elements and each other, they could potentially succeed. And I think Susie kind of like really resonates with me in so many ways, despite being a person who is kind of the opposite and almost the antithesis of a character I would generally enjoy. So I think there's a lot to go there. But where do we go next on the Susie journey, Nige?
Well, for people who maybe have not seen Gabon recently, or, I think a fair point to make, maybe Susie did not catch their attention in their first watch through. Kevin, do you have some quick baseball facts on the baseball card to share about Susie to refresh people's memory?
Yes, and the intro kind of covered a lot of these things because I do think most of Susie's accomplishments can be set on literally on the back of a baseball card because they don't give her a whole lot. Susie Smith, 47 years old, from Charles City, Iowa, the runner-up of Survivor Gabon. She's notable for...
Of course, she was from Iowa. Queen.
Right?
I'm obsessed.
I know.
Yeah.
It's like she's like a Midwestern chatterbox that gets no edit. Like what's happening? It's just so fascinating to me. She wins the first and last immunity challenge. She is known for kind of flipping the game in and taking out the front runner in Marcus. I mean, she's kind of the reason why we get that iconic GIF of Maddie and Susie, Maddie and Sugar and Corinne because of her game decisions.
I want to quickly interrupt and say, as someone who joined the fandom, much later, I remember when I was watching Gabon for the first time and I get to that scene and you start to have the reactions. I just paused and I was like, it's from the GIF. I know I've seen this before. How exciting.
Yeah. And I think Susie did that. Anything that she slightly touches, I'm like, and that was her, even if it was not intentional. And, she gets 3 votes to win. And had she won and beat Bob, she would be the oldest player to ever win Survivor. So I think there is something really kind of interesting about Susie on paper, despite not having the most interesting story. But I think there's also a huge question about like, well, why didn't she get a better story? Because I think this on paper, this actually is kind of captivating and like we couldn't weave something in. So I think there's a lot to do with that, but I think there's only so many Susie moments to talk about, even though I could probably think of 50 off the top of my head. But Maggie, is there a Susie moment or thing that kind of comes to your mind when you hear her name?
Oh, yes. So one of my favorite moments in Survivor Gabon in general is when they're at the auction and Susie spends all her money on a bath. And she's like, I'm getting in the bath. Woo! And she gets in the bathtub and she stays in the bathtub. And I mean, in Gabon, they got filthy. Like all their clothes were filthy brown, the exact same color of brown, all of them by the end. And Susie showed up wearing a hot pink shirt. And by the end, it was brown. Like they were so filthy out there. She gets in the bath for maybe 35 seconds. And then she's like, no, too hot. It's too hot in this bath. And everybody's like, Susie, are you crazy? You just spent $500 on this bath. You're not going to sit in there the whole time. And she was like, too hot. And she got out and she sat in a little towel with suds on her shoulder for the rest of the time, not even taking her bath that she paid $500 for. And that to me is the epitome of Susie on Survivor.
And again, if you can enjoy camp, you can really enjoy this moment, right?
Yeah. My favorite thing about Susie is that I feel like because she has like a unique, like, she's won, like I said in the intro, she's won more immunity challenges, individual immunity than James Clement, and more jury votes than Stephen Fishbach. Two people who are respected in their specific kind of like areas on Survivor. Something I always like to remind myself is that Susie, won the fire making challenge at the final 9. And so I like to think she would have won every single fire making challenge at the final 4 in the new format. It's like, y'all couldn't even handle Susie. If she was at Winners at War, she would have beat all of you. Like, it's like, you get to kind of like create this whole fantasy world of Susie, a pretty like benign person, being good at like some of these specific skills. And maybe the actual moment I'm really coming to my mind right now is in the tribe pick'em early on. I think this tells you a lot about Susie's edit as a character, is that she gets picked really early. Jillian is a tribe elder, so she picks Crystal, a natural like pick as like an athletic, strong woman, and then Crystal picks Susie, and we immediately hear Charlie go, start playing stupid Survivor? Don't you want to win immunity challenges? Like, clearly she's unathletic. Clearly she can't like do a whole lot. And guess who goes home when Susie wins immunity at the final 9? Charlie does, right? Like, so to me, there's like a poetic justice that occurs. And I think really the cool moment is, Susie gets called really early, and it kind of shocks a lot of people. And then Susie, when she gets called, she goes, knew it. she's like so confident. It's like, why are you so confident that you wouldn't pick like 3rd out of all these people? You heard all of their professions, all of their backgrounds, and you're like, I knew I was going to be picked. There's something so interesting about someone like that to me. What about you, Nige?
Well, I think that was definitely my favorite moment of Susie, of just her so confidently walking forward, being like, yeah, I knew it. When like everything about her edit is everyone underestimating her or undervaluing her, and for her to walk forward with like such confidence, because I think that when Charlie says, oh, are we playing stupid Survivor now? I do think that like there is some preconceived idea of who you quote should be picking in that moment, right? A lot of people will notice that in the pre-merge, women tend to be voted out a lot more frequently because there is an idea that you want to value strength, and they perceive women as weaker on average, right? So for her to be so confident in that moment, saying like, "Oh, I knew I would be picked 3rd," I just thought it was so much fun to see that, and I think it does set you up for this person who's just kind of an enigma across the season.
I mean, I think it illuminates she has no social awareness.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean? Like, you knew you were going to be picked. You are like one of the oldest women out there. Like, I would have assumed, having a social awareness, that I would be picked last. And then she goes on to lose in Final Tribal because of her lack of social awareness. I just feel like it's all very full circle with our girl Suze.
But she joins the team with Jillian and Crystal, and so maybe she's just like, yeah, they're picking ladies. Yeah, I knew
moms.
I would be the next one.
They're all moms, and she gets picked way ahead of Charlie and Corinne, and she outlasts them both in the game, obviously, as well. And quite often we're told that Susie's bad at challenges, or because of her appearance. Charlie's like, oh, don't you want to win immunity? She beats him. Corinne later, the scene we get all a lot is that Susie like insults her by saying that she does more around camp than her, and that like at tribal council she kind of doubles down and goes, well, I think I have more upper body strength than Corinne, and also beats Corinne at challenges, like is stronger than Corinne in technically. But like, even I think like to have such a negative impression about Susie kind of really relies a lot about implicit bias, in my opinion, because it's an assumption that like, what does it mean to say that Susie should not have been picked? Or like, what does that really mean? Because it's like only specific types of people should be picked. And those people have certain values and attributes that we care about. I always found it really telling, because this is Charlie again. And I think the Onions Alliance is like the epitome of like corporate yuppie elitism, which is kind of fun. And I love to see them kind of be shooken up by someone like Susie of all people. But there's a moment when after Marcus goes and they all go back to camp, Charlie's talking to Corinne. He goes, oh, Ace, Dan, Marcus, they're getting rid of all the power players. And I'm like, Dan was not a power player. He was like on his own. He had nothing, but like, you think he's a power player because he's like a tall, strong, athletic, educated man. And Susie doesn't fit any of those descriptions. And so it's like, I think quite often people have pigeonholed Susie into a specific role that she does not because she's not very socially aware or the most astute, she quite often doesn't realize she is pushing back on a lot of people's preconceived notions. And someone who's doing that, is probably not going to do very well in Survivor anyways. But I kind of love and hate the edit of Gabon at times, because we're kind of played off to be like, Corinne and Charlie are all right in those moments, that Susie is the fool.
Yes.
But like Susie actually
yes.
outlasts them. She does better than them, but we are not told that. Like Bob is constantly being told he is the diamond in the rough. Like when he gets picked very late in the second pick-em when they all rank each other. But none of that is ever given to Susie, despite literally being underestimated at every turn, flipping the game at key intervals. And I just think it's very interesting that Bob gets that, but Susie doesn't. I think that has a lot to do with, of course, that Bob is the winner and Susie's the runner-up, and you have to tell why Susie lost. So some early thoughts.
So, now I think we want to spend a little time speaking about trying to understand the current consensus, like what the general fan base thinks about Susie. And as always, Kevin, I know you've done a little bit of internet research to help prepare us.
Yes. So I searched the web and I searched Susie Smith multiple times. And let me tell you, Susie Smith of Gabon is not the only Susie Smith out there. So sometimes you got to pull through articles that are really not relevant at all. But looking at this research, some of the things I've noticed. First, she is a meme queen. Susie Smith is a meme queen because if you search her on Reddit, here's some of the types of posts that you'll see. With 122 upvotes, Susie Smith holds the record for most individual immunities of any Latina on Survivor, which is again, random and surprising to most people. Underreported fact, Susie Smith has a perfect voting record, 98 upvotes. Another one here. Reminder that this losing finalist received more votes than Russell did in 2 final tribal councils combined. You click on it, and of course, it's Susie Smith, right? So Susie's kind of almost like the specter of the under-edited character, right? In the consciousness of people who really like her. The disrespected finalist, the UTR person that kind of pops up randomly, kind of like Natalie Bolton does as well. Like she's very under the radar and then has these big spurts, but they're very minimal. And so I just think there's she kind of stands as a figure in that. Maggie, is this surprising to you? Do you feel like were you aware that she was kind of almost like a cult favorite, perhaps?
Of course. That's like I said, if you enjoy camp, you get Susie. This meme of it, you're saying this person has this amazing record, and then you see it's Susie because it's so underwhelming on the surface, right? It's wait, this person who I think had 4 confessionals the whole season who didn't even take her bath, and what? What do you mean she has all of these accomplishments? But that's just, and the person who at Final Tribal Council said she tried hard. What do you mean she's got the most individual immunity wins? But it's very poetic for the season she was on, And I think that it also has to do with Gabon, the characters who really pop in Gabon and we as the audience are told are the capable characters, are the Charlies and the Corinnes, right? And by Corinne goes on the other moment of Susie that I remember, Susie wasn't even in it. It was Corinne going on her rant about how Susie is the B word. And if you're an audience member at home and you're like, yeah, Corinne's one of the people on this season with sense, that's what you're going to think. You're going to think that Susie's lazy around camp because this is all through Corinne's, point of view. Susie's lazy around camp. She's bad at challenges. She's a total bitch. Sorry, I don't know if I should swear, but those are Corinne's words in the iconic confessional. And so I think that, of course, you're going to undervalue her. That combined with little to no confessionals, very little screen time, of course you're going to undervalue this person. So when you see on paper the things that she accomplished, it's hilarious. It's perfect. Yeah. It's so ironic.
Yeah.
And I think that that's one of the things that has made Susie endure as someone that you talk about from Gabon, because there are finalists across the history of Survivor that I don't think actually get even as much attention as Susie does. Kim Johnson from Africa, I think, is an example. But
yeah,
it's interesting because Susie, like you're saying, Maggie, I think on paper, you can point to specific things of why she should be getting attention or more of a focus from the edit. But the way that she communicates, I just don't think is the most captivating from like the confessionals or what the show finds to be most interesting. But because she's a finalist who loses by one vote, they have to tell her story. And what I think is really interesting is to consider, what would Gabon look like if Susie wins by one vote? Let's say that, you know, you have Randy decide in that moment he's not upset about the cookies or whatever and does vote for Susie. I think that the whole season is told in a very different way. You are probably not focusing as much on the confessionals from the Onions that are hyping themselves up, that are like putting Susie down. You're maybe picking just a couple of words from a Marcus confessional that make her happen to look better and only including that. And I think, you know, the audience would then have a completely different view of Susie, but she's almost like such a blank canvas for the editors that it's like very easy for them to not lift her up.
Yeah. And then like you get to now use her to slam any finalist you didn't think deserved to be there. Right. So let's say you hate Xander, because Xander was actually had, I think, a fairly decent edit and had a lot of voracious fans. And so like, if you want to be like, you think Xander was good, Susie got 3 more jury votes than him. You know, like you can use Susie as like a really as a reference point so easily. And I think that's kind of like part of the charm of Susie. And I think also maybe the frustration for people who don't seem to be these big fans of hers. Did you want to kind of dive into this? What would Gabon be if Susie was the winner, like the story? Or
I mean, I just think that you are going to, you have the moments of her talking about needing to put her game ahead, right? Like when she's swapped and it's Crystal, Kenny, Marcus, and Maddie.
Oh, Mark. So you're talking the Coda.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, the Marcus boot. Yeah.
The Marcus boot. You have the 5 of them, and Susie is, you know, telling Marcus she may go with him, but she may not, because she needs to put her game first, right? That's something that I think
about
in modern
subtle
Survivor,
as subtle as like a hammer. Like and that's the thing. Oh my God, she's just so bad socially. It's so funny. It's so funny. Sorry. She's hilarious. Oh God.
She's not giving them what they want, right? And I think it's interesting that, you know, the Crystal side of the tribe, you know, they want her to be with them, right? Like they need her number and they try to get her. And it feels like the Onions should be able to do a minimal amount of work to just make her feel comfortable, but they are not capable of making her feel comfortable. And I don't think that we talk enough about the Onions' inability to keep Susie within their orbit.
Yeah, because we are framed that Susie is the irrational player when her decisions were all very rational. Like all of the choice, like
totally,
even her social interactions are a bit different. I think it's we'd be remiss to say like that Susie is very different than a lot of these cast members. She does not have the same things in common. The Onions, you know, especially before Randy joins them, is like highly educated. A lot of them are like Ivy Leaguers who work in like corporate America or all these other fields. Like Susie doesn't watch Frasier or whatever, like that they're valuing.
They pass around that blazer. All of them wear that blazer, all those onions in their confessionals. You're so right. It's like very, like they're in Africa and they're all wearing a blazer, you know?
Yeah.
That's funny.
Maggie, I love the imagery of the blazer because it's not just a jacket that they're sharing. It's kind of a persona, right? Think of like the mall rats where they all have like their matching bracelets. I think it's very poetic that the Onions are sharing a blazer.
Yeah, and so like, but why don't we ever talk like people know the Onions like the things they're not nearly as negative because one of their own, Bob, even though he was at the bottom of that group, succeeds, and they kind of crown him like they all vote together. So you really, I think, have trouble as an editor. How do you kind of get around this?
But, you know, if they had all had a blazer, right? Maybe it's like a little bit easier to physically identify them. That's probably just like the white collar outfits that they're like stranded with.
A little bit, right? But, you know, I think there's something to be said about Susie and Sugar, who are, I think there's a lot of classist overtones in the final tribal council against both of them, right? Because they outsmarted this group of people who were supposed to probably dominate almost any other season of Survivor. And so, like, to me, there is just like, it's just so interesting to think about it like that. What I wanted to say about Susie, though, was, you know, like I said, the Onions, we take what all they say is like truth. And like, we see that confessional about her and Corinne about like, oh, I was going to vote you off. You know, like we get that a lot. We see that in every single recap. Like Susie is just like unhinged. She's a loose cannon. And like that moment is played on repeat So of course that's kind of like what we are remembering. But like, you know, when Marcus goes home in that episode at Tribal Council, Bob says in front of Susie, who's literally the swing vote, I kind of regret my vote last night. I think maybe I should have voted the different way. And like the other way was to vote Susie out instead of Dan. And it's like, that is never replayed a billion times because he's the winner and you're supposed to treat him positively.
Yeah. Listen, I am not saying that he was much better socially than Susie, but I'm saying I saw with my own 2 eyes her go to Marcus and be like, I don't know. What can you do for me? Like, just like no attempt to make him feel good at all, you know, like, and I just think that it's just so funny. It just cracks me up, you know?
It cracks me up, but you know what I also find so interesting is that, like, again, it's like Susie's, you know, of course she's stepping on toes. She's like being very direct, but it's like, Marcus, it's a direct question. Why can't you answer it? Like, why can't, like, you still chose not to vote for her even. Like, you could have done that and you still chose not to. You chose to want to keep her in your group despite her being clearly very obvious with you. And I feel like we should like dock Marcus that, but quite often Marcus is the person a lot of people would say was one of the few smart players of the game. When it's like, well, would a smart player be outfoxed by Susie Smith? Perhaps, you know, like, so I think there's interesting things. What I wanted to dive into again is a bit more of the current consensus on Susie. There was a popularity poll in 2016 on the Survivor subreddit where they ranked everyone, put them scores between 1 and 10. Maggie, of about nearly 600 contestants that were ranked, this is like 2016, so it's like around co-wrong time. Where do you think Susie Smith fell? Do you think she was top half, bottom half, you know, top 10, bottom 50? Where's your gut telling you?
I think she lived somewhere. There were about 600 contestants.
At that time, yeah.
I think she is high 400s.
She is number 299. So,
oh, good job, Susie.
Yeah.
That's great.
Sneaking into top half.
Well, I think she's, I think there's like 575. So it's again, she's in that middle.
So she's about like 3 out of 7 jury votes.
Yeah, she's like again, like that's like she's like she's always polling around like 45%. You know, she's like a presidential approval rate. Yeah. So some other interesting things I wanted to mention about this was that he gave some demographic data of certain types of people that tended to rate Susie more highly or what was correlated with her. For example, if whatever score you gave Susie quite often correlated to scores you gave to Lydia from Guatemala, Edna from South Pacific, and Crystal Cox from Gabon.
Yes.
Right?
The Camp Queens. Are you kidding?
All like, women of color.
All the best people.
Yeah, women of color who I think almost kind of sometimes get reduced down to just like one moment or one line or one quote. So I think that makes sense. And the negative correlation, so the people who tend to be the most opposite of Susie are Africa Lex, Boston Rob from All Stars, and Cochran from South Pacific, all almost maybe overexposed characters.
Yeah, and also like super, and you know, I don't want to, I'm trying to think of the right way to phrase this. Like sort of they play a very specific way, all 3 of them, that falls under this like mastermind, total control, everybody is under my thumb way. And that is not the way that somebody like Susie, passive queen, plays. Yeah. You know, like that's just the exact opposite of the way that she plays.
Totally. And I think that, you know, there's also, I think, a seriousness that you are taking with some of these characters. You know, Cochran is obviously meant to be much more of a comedic force, I think, in Survivor. But, you know, for his winning season, you know, with Boston Rob and Lex, I think that these are all people who are taking the game very seriously. You know, it is about being here to win. And Lydia, Edna, Crystal, these are people that you are like memeing, right? Like you are making a meme out of them. You don't make a meme out of Boston Rob. You evaluate his gameplay and like, did he make the right move right here?
Yes.
But I think this also tells you a lot about like, who do producers feel like are worth investing in? Because the men that I named are all people who are almost like the center point of their season, almost like the first person you'd call from each of those seasons to return. And the people I named who correlated with Susie are not. And I think it's like, you know, I love a character that is not nearly as spoon-fed to us because I think that's just more interesting than someone who's much more like center focused. And I think, you know, at the end of the day, I don't think there's people who were playing the game with Susie that could really relate to her. So she didn't do very well with them. And I'm sure there's producers who couldn't really relate to Susie either. They didn't know how to tell her story very well. I mean, we talk a lot about the diversity in the show, and I can't imagine that the people behind the camera particularly know a lot of Susies in their lives either. And I think the choices reflect that. The last thing I kind of wanted to quickly
wonder.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just on that point, I also wonder how well Susie was able to tell her own story. And I think that is like, she is the prime example of somebody on a show who is not going to be able to tell her own story probably very succinctly, because we even saw that at Final Tribal. Like, her big point was that she tried really hard, which, like, I think that we've talked about this entire podcast. There is so much more to her game than that she tried really hard, but that's sort of what she reduced it down to herself. So I think that entire combination ends up with this like ghost edit of a woman who, the two big moments that you get are her telling Corinne that she was going to vote her out, and her asking Marcus, what can he do for her? I think that all of that sort of creates this perfect storm of this like memeable type finalist who almost won the game,
Yeah. And I think the word try thing is very interesting, because I remember watching the finale when I got around to it, was that I was like, oh, it's kind of like incoherent. She's like saying it a lot. Like, it's clearly not working. And I think Susie's not someone who is the best equipped at like reading a room. I will not sign up for like Susie Smith running like an open mic night by any means, right? Like, she doesn't know how to really tell a joke. She's not particularly charming in particular, but she seems like a nice person, like someone who's not like mean spirited, which maybe is why she definitely did not fit in with the Gabon cast. Like, maybe in other seasons, she actually is someone who could find allies easily, because why wouldn't you like Susie? She's like a hard worker. Every time you cut to her, she's carrying a log or something, like in Coda especially. And she actually reminds me a lot of the, I guess what resonates with me is kind of the depiction of Susie as like the classic like immigrant story. She's a woman of color. She was actually born to like migrant farm workers, right? And she like worked in the fields growing up, and now she's with these like yuppies who she keeps her head down. She works hard. She's willing to kind of put herself first at key moments in the game. And at the end of the day, that group was still like, we don't like you. You're not cool. You're not interesting. You're not charming. You're not worth whatever this is. But I think what is a part of that, though, is I think there's a lot of preconceived notions with Susie. And I think it's so easy to dismiss Susie as a player because she is a bit socially awkward. But I think Survivor's littered with socially awkward people who, like I said, Bob is also having social faux pas at times, but is rewarded. And Susie's never even remotely spoken about. Susie, like I said, ranked around number 300 in that popularity poll. Bob is 150 spots higher than her, right? So, like, who's resonating with audiences, I think, is something that is very interesting.
And I think as an audience, we're supposed to resonate with Bob. That is a goal that the editors had, because he ends up winning, and they clearly did not invest in Susie as a character. And I think, to give them a little bit of credit here, there were a lot of characters on Gabon that they needed to be splitting some time with. I just think they could have spent a little more time building up Susie as a character.
And you mentioned the word try, Maggie. So I actually read Susie's bio before coming on, because I thought it was interesting, because also what producers choosing to put out front in the pre-show footage as well. So here's some things about Susie. Tired of working hard and being poor, Smith vows to devote the rest of her life to her needs. After years of allowing others to influence her life, she decided to stop and dedicate this next chapter to herself. And taking part in Survivor was the first step. And second was showing her son, family, friends, and students that all it takes to change any part of your life is to just try, right? So I think in many ways, Susie came in with a concept of like, I will be, like, I'm Suri Fields. I got off the couch. Like, I'm doing the things that like, and putting myself out there. And I think this group of elitists really just were not interested in it at all. And they did not buy into the narrative that she was selling in the way that in Tokensheens, Steven also talks about, like, I came out of here, I had no wilderness experience, and I learned how to make a fire and survive on exile. And like, Brendan comes up and is like, you think that's enough to get you $1 million? Like, people are not interested in that. And I think Susie in particular did not know how to pivot well beyond that, because I think if she had like the right like debate coach, she would have highlighted other things or approached things differently. But she takes things very literally, which makes it really hard. And Corinne is like very witty, and I'm sure like Susie's not someone you can bounce off very well, right? Like, these are just people who did not connect with her, and I find it a little disappointing, because I think makes sense why they did not like her. Generally, it's like, you guys, did you really try to get to know her? Because someone who like worked as like in like this migrant like crop worker family. Like there's interesting stories here, there's experiences here, but I think at the end of the day, Susie's maybe just a little lame in their eyes. You know, she lists one of her hobbies as going to the movies. And like she says going to the movies and going out to eat. You know, like this is not someone who's probably the most like interesting person to be around. And I kind of feel bad for Susie at times, because I really don't think they gave her a whole lot of chances, and I don't think she did a lot with the chances that she was given even.
You know, I also think a challenge that Susie faced in the final tribal, when she's supposed to be talking about her story, is that I think Susie is too humble at times. And I don't even mean,
Yes.
you know, someone who's like, oh, well, you know,
Definitely.
I don't want to toot my own horn too much, but she's like, I just wanted to try, and not really, I think, like
Mhm.
building a larger case. And at least my interpretation of it is that like she's just not like thinking in that same way of like talking yourself up at every opportunity you can. You know, looking to the most recent final tribal that we saw, you know, Cassidy and Owen are mega super fans of the show. They have a deep understanding of like archetype, how you are perceived, what you want to be highlighting, what you're not. They have like a deep game plan going into final tribal, and have, you know, an argument that I in a narrative I think they're trying to stick to. And I think Susie was probably far more authentic going up there, but I think that that's something that also hurt her in front of the jury.
Mhm.
Yeah, and I think that's
Definitely.
what I think is so interesting about Susie, is that she's like the opposite of Corinne. Like she doesn't play it for the cameras at all. She does not have an
Mhm.
image that she's trying to promote. She doesn't even care really about being cool or liked. You know, the onions care about those type of things, right? Like they are a little bit more, I think, trained in the office politics, in the way that you should modulate your personality. Think about Corinne. You know, she hates Susie, but she's like, that's a very fair point that she made. Like everything is so measured, and Susie's like very
Mhm.
direct, and like I think just has very different cultural like connections to these players around her. And I kind of like the fact that she's like a lame mom who's like totally unaware of the cameras, and is just kind of like, yeah, why wouldn't you just ask what your position in the game is? And thank God she did, because as much as people like to give credit to the onions for being smart, they were all willing to let Marcus beat them at the end. And it's like, to me, like in a universe where, and we're about to hit the dark ages in a few seasons after Gabon, what I would have done for Andrea Belke or Ashley Underwood or Natalie Tenorelli or any of these other characters who kind of just let these like dominant alpha males waltz to the end, stand up like Susie did, and shift the game when given the opportunity to. And so I really draw a lot of parallels with the, again, like this kind of classist overtone, because, you know, Susie's talking about just trying and getting out there and like doing it and risking it all. And the onions were like, we don't want you to try. We want you to accept your station in life and sit down and let us walk over you. And they were very upset that I think someone like Susie outplayed them. And I think the fact that she's not particularly charismatic even made that worse for them. Like, we're not even losing someone who's like unathletic. We're losing someone who's not very socially competent either. What I wanted to kind of wrap up on this segment about the current consensus is that Survivor Quotes X, a Twitter page, did a series of polls in 2022 asking who you, the viewer, would have voted for in all these different final tribal council combinations. So, for example, JT beat out Steven 57-43.
Wow. Big difference than the jury that was there.
Yes. Right. Typically, there's over 1,000 votes in each of these polls. And of course, this is a very specific corner of the internet, so it's like a self-selection bias as well. In Gabon, Maggie, what percentage do you think Susie got from the viewers? What percentage of people who participated in this poll you think voted for Susie?
Was your option all three?
Susie,
finalists?
Bob, and Sugar.
I was about to say, well, I feel like Sugar probably got a decent amount of the online votes, because I think that Sugar, upon reflection, I know you said Kenny and Crystal, you feel like drove the strategy of the season. Hardcore agree. Sugar drove what happened, though. Like the final decision was Sugar's to make at every turn about what actually was going to happen. So I would say 30% for Susie. 35. Yeah, 35.
Susie got 19%. Only 19%.
Rough.
Bob 39, Sugar 42. So
Yeah.
what
Mhm.
this stood out to me was that, you know, out of all these polls, other than Redemption Island, where Rob got 83, Philip 6, Natalie 11, it's the only final tribal council poll where the second placer is ranked last, right? So Natalie Tenorelli and Sugar, beat out Susie and Philip. And Sugar's a 0 vote finalist that beats out both the winner and the runner-up. And so, as much as I think like Susie is a meme queen and has like a vocal like minority of people that care about her, it really isn't that many people, which is kind of what inspired the idea to talk about Susie, because I think a lot of people just kind of chalk her up as someone who didn't do anything. I think a lot of people think of her as someone maybe who didn't even get any votes to win, even though she was 1 vote away from winning. So I just think she's like an interesting person to kind of examine. Do you think there's anything else to mention in this kind of like segment about how kind of current fans feel about her, or the modern day perception?
No, I don't think I have anything about the current consensus on her, but Maggie, I do want to hear from you. So you watched the first 20 seasons chronologically in order. When was that compared to like the live broadcast?
2019.
Okay,
I watched them all in order.
So still fairly recent, and you were unspoiled going through it. So do you remember, I guess, like after having seen how Gabon played out, do you remember your views on Susie changing at all since that initial watch where you probably got like more plugged in with the Survivor community?
No, not really. I think that she, I think that the problem, I think that maybe my views on her changed a little bit when I got greater context overall for her, because I think that my views on Survivor as a whole and like as a game and the game mechanics of Survivor has sort of evolved over time. Specifically since I've been watching it play out live, like actually watching live since 41. I think that I have different feelings there. So maybe my views changed on her in terms of like what she was doing and how she was accomplishing it and how she could have won. Like I think maybe I went from thinking like, oh my God, I can't believe she almost won. That's crazy. To being like, okay, how could she have won? Like she did play a good enough game she was the best player out of the 3. So like, what could she have done to get those votes at the end? And I do think maybe my mind shifted on like, if I'm thinking about it strategically, and like going through the scenarios in my head, but like my feeling on her as a player, no, it's remained the same, I think.
I think that's an interesting point, Maggie, because I've thought about it, and I think that other than Dominic, you could argue that Susie is in a whatever number tie for being the closest to winning Survivor without actually winning, because it's not just being 1 vote short. You have somebody who was a juror that did not vote for her, that at least at one time said, I regret voting the way that I did. I mean, I don't think you can get that much closer. So to look at the game, reflecting back and saying, how could she have won? It's
Who
weird
said they
to
regretted
me.
it? Sorry,
It was
who said they regretted it?
Randy.
Oh,
at the
okay.
reunion, he also mentions that well, I think he said post show, but then he's kind of seen as the swing vote, because he even says at tribal council, it's like, please don't make me vote for Susie. He says that to Bob, like, because Susie's the only person that didn't laugh when I was being humiliated.
And so, even if there's only a specific segment of time in which Randy would have regretted not voting for Susie, he did get there at one point, which means that Susie could totally have won. And I think it's almost bizarre to think about how likely it was that she could have won, instead of like how interesting that she got that close. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think I like Susie as a figure so much more exciting as the loser, because then she's like the what if. Then like, if she was actually the winner, I think, I mean, they probably give her an edit similar to Vesepia's, and they didn't give her much of an edit either. As someone who kind of like ebbed and flowed in the game. So
she's a good winner though. Vesepia is a really good winner.
I think Vesepia's a good winner, and I guess maybe the comparison I'm making here is that they were both willing to flip. I think they both won the same amount of immunity challenges, by the way, for those keeping track at home. And, both were willing to vote out some of the people that they were most easily to beat. Like Vecepia was willing to vote out Nalia during the Purple Rock towards the end. And Nalia is probably the easiest person for her to defeat. Susie, is like certainly, she votes out Crystal, Kenny, and she's like willing to vote out Sugar perhaps at the final four. Like, it's not like as if they always have the fully best read, but they are aware that you should be self-interested if you want to advance yourself. And I think a lot of people came hard on them because, they were people who, seemingly nice people who suggested that they were like role models in some way or, wanted to be representation in some way. And I think for a lot of their competitors, they were like, why? Like they just felt like that was not relevant to them. So I draw like a parallel of, because I think of the Gabon group overthrowing the Onions very much like the Rotu 4 being overthrown as well. It really is a power shift, shifting to a multiracial, more working class, more emotionally dynamic group of people. And I love the fact that Gabon gets to have that, because I feel like in so many seasons, the Onions would run the table, and thank God they didn't this time. So just some thoughts about that. I wanted to talk about Jeff's reaction. Now, Maggie, do you recall anything about how Jeff felt about Susie at all?
Yeah, he hated her, right? He hated her.
Yeah. In short,
that makes sense to me. I mean, I don't think it's right, but that totally makes sense to me that he wouldn't like her based off of the people that Jeff really enjoys, and the winners that I feel he's been vocal about really enjoying. That makes sense that he was like not into the game that Susie played.
Yeah. And, Maggie, I think what I will bring it back to, again, a running theme is camp, because I got into Survivor right around Cagayan. So the second live season in the preseason experience I got to have was for Worlds Apart. And Jeff was hyping up Worlds Apart so much. He was talking about how great the season was going to be. And Worlds Apart feels like one of the least campy seasons out there. It's just very serious, and I don't think has a lot of like joy in it. Well, and so
Jeff takes his show incredibly seriously, as he should, he absolutely, like, he's built this incredible show. He takes it very seriously. And these people kind of made a mockery of his show, and look, I love every second of it. But like what they were doing out there was not the Survivor that Jeff likes to make, and so it doesn't surprise me at all that he was not into what was going on Gabon, because it's silliness. It was pure silliness,
Yeah, I think you're totally right, Maggie. He takes the show so seriously and wants people to have reverence for it, and I think that he has issues with Greg Buis in Borneo as someone who is not taking the show very seriously. But Kevin, I know that you've mentioned before that Gabon is right around the time that Jeff starts to get more influence in production beyond just being a host.
Yeah, he becomes like an executive producer around this time. And I feel like Gabon stands out as a season where in the recaps, a lot of editorialization, like he is like saying, and the Fongs asked for a death wish by voting out Jackie. And I'm like, Jackie was not part of their alliance. She's with Marcus and all of them. Like, why would that make any sense for them? It's like Susie's, was clueless. And I'm like, Susie's voted right on every single vote. Like, to me, it was actually very interesting because I feel like there's a story that we're being told that does not exactly match what is happening, on the island, or if you look at the raw data of it, of the entire experience. And so, definitely, I think Jeff's perspective is very clear and the types of people that he likes to see succeed in the show. And I think we should be very critical of like how the show also chose to portray certain types of people and what types of people tend to get better edits. We know in Survivor, even especially at this point as well, that men get way more confessionals than women, that people of color tend to be under-edited or kind of stereotypical. I mean, look at Gabon. Crystal is an angry Black woman by the edits and Jeff's like suggestions in storytelling. Kenny is like an awkward Asian man. Susie's like a dumb, like hardworking immigrant. Like, I mean, these are not particularly colorful or complex, flattering things. Charlie's reduced down to his sexuality, Oling just talking about Marcus. And while I can really enjoy, because I think there are truths in some of these portrayals, right? Like it's not like you made these things up, but like the choices to highlight specific attributes or not suggest maybe an alternative perspective of things, is just interesting to me. And I want to be critical of Jeff because, I'm an old school purist. And when Jeff took control, that's when we seeing a lot more of like the fire making twist at Final Four and like the stuff I don't tend to care for as much. And people should recall that when asked about why didn't we do Winners at War earlier, he suggested that we didn't have enough interesting female winners, which I think is complete BS by anyone's like objective assessment. And so it's like, I'm sure you have to imagine at least a small percentage of that also plays out in the way that Susie is also kind of like depicted and spoken about. In his article after the finale, he writes in an EW article, if Susie had won, I don't know what I would have said or how I would have justified such a decision by the jury. Yes, Susie did a good job making it far enough to put her position to have a shot at the money, but to get 3 votes and nearly a 4th from Randy really surprised me. He then goes on to say, if this were a fair game, which it often is not, Sugar would have received a few votes and Susie would have had none. I mean, that's pretty damning,
yeah.
you know?
It's like intense to say. I don't know if I agree with everything he said, but I do think Sugar should have gotten a couple votes in that final tribal. So, and look, she didn't because of her own doing, you know, like it and of course Survivor is not fair. None of these games are fair. You know, it's social dynamics. It's not fair. Everything, you know, goes into it. But I think, you know, it's just funny to hear that from him. You know, I think that, but you know, there are some seasons that I feel that way about the person who wins. I am so upset about it. I do not think they deserve it. I will never tell you on this podcast who I'm talking about. My best friend knows, but I will never say live on the internet who I'm talking about. But there are absolutely people will be very mad at me that when they won their season, I was so upset about and was like, they don't deserve it, whatever. And then when you take a step back and you know, reevaluate. And I think, you know, it just goes to show the way that people at the time were viewing the season as a whole, you know, that he was like the person who almost won. What? And the person who got who was a 0 vote final tribalist. What? You know, I think that maybe like we saw a little bit of that confusion from the audience this season, you know, less from Jeff, but I think that, you know, that happens sometimes. And everything that we've been talking about on this podcast is really great in shedding light on the things that Susie did that were positive and, you know, contributed to those 3 votes that she got. And I just that those quotes are very funny to me.
You know, I remember watching the finale. It's either the end of the final tribal or when you're actually in the finale. And Jeff makes comments of like, Susie, you got 3 votes. How did that happen? Like, try to explain that for us. And when I was like hearing that, I was like, Jeff, this feels like something someone with a bad social game would be saying in public in front of people. Like wait,
her family's here.
Yeah,
how dare you?
Like TV. Like, come on.
You know, it's just
I know.
And like I love the word, fair, right? Because I think it also rings the bell to the word deserving, which is one of my least favorite words, I think, in Survivor. And of course, it's one the onions love to use when Marcus goes home and they go, Corinne says, I think Marcus deserved to be here. And I've always applauded Kenny and Susie for being like, well, who's to say who deserves to be here? We all deserve to be here. If we weren't, we wouldn't be here.
And Corinne's like, yeah, we all deserve it. But Marcus really, really deserved it.
And I think Jeff like echoes some of that assessment that at the end of the day, like there's something unfair about like Susie winning votes, but like she won them fair and square. So that's the definition of fair. But like you have like a sense of like what is right on Survivor or the right way to play things.
Yeah,
or do things. And I think I think we should be aware of our own biases when we start saying things like that. And especially if they're people who are likely from more marginalized communities, people who don't get a lot of representation. And I think it's like not crazy to give Susie a slightly better edit because you give her 2 more confessionals and I'm sure you could have filled in a few of the blanks in. I looked at her edgic, which is a great way to kind of look at the edits that were a contestant got at the time. So it gives you different scores, positively toned, negatively toned, were you over the top, under the radar, stuff like that. Susie lasts 13 episodes in Survivor Gabon. She's ranked under the radar or invisible, so like no real presence in an episode. 9 out of 13 episodes.
That tracks.
9 out of 13.
Tracks for what I saw.
for someone that was one vote away from winning, I think you cannot. At the end of the day, like, why did we see like scenes of her like bonding with Crystal and Kenny, even like, or Maddie? I mean, Maddie and Susie were seemingly close, but like we feel like we never actually really see footage of those things.
And I'll go back to what you've said before, Maggie, where you think that Sugar should have received a couple of votes. And
I do.
I
really
know
do.
that when I first watched Gabon, I was really on, I think like the same train of being surprised that Sugar got 0 votes, because I think she was like so influential. But rewatching the season, I think coming at it with like a little bit of a different lens, because I had seen so many seasons by that point, I think I was more aware of Sugar, I think, making decisions and then maybe changing her mind about it down the road, or being like wishy-washy about the decisions. And I think that coming back to that and realizing that made me have a better appreciation for why she did not end up getting votes. But what I think is interesting is that I think realistically, the show probably saw Sugar as a star, realized that they had hit like gold in trying to put a good product forward. They bring her back for Heroes versus Villains just a couple seasons later, and they probably built her up more as a character than they normally would for a third place loser in the final tribal. And it's likely, at least to a degree, at the expense of Susie.
Yeah, I mean, I think it has to be. And I think, at the end of the day, Sugar is a very captivating contestant. We don't get a lot of people like Sugar who make the end game either. But, I think at the end of the day, it's just egregious to give your second placer, 1 vote away from winning, who theoretically could have won. I mean, no real story. I mean, what's the relationship we hear most about Susie? It's probably Corinne. And it's through Corinne's eyes more often, not even Susie's. I mean, talk about having like really no story here to kind of create. I just found it, a little disappointing. Bob, who's also known for being kind of under the radar, is only rated as under the radar 5 out of his 13. So Susie nearly twice as much. And Susie only gets toned in 2 episodes. So she's rated positively in one and negatively in another. Bob is rated positively 8 out of 13 episodes. So there's like the music cues, the signs. And I think that's like a huge part about Susie that I find so interesting, is that, when Susie's a swing vote during the Marcus boot, it's like they actually show her do a confessional where she's kind of trailing off a little bit. Like she's still like not very intelligent or doesn't understand things. It's like, well, but she is making the best game move. So why are you telling that story in that way? That is a choice. These are choices that people in a room are making, and they've chosen to not give her even a semblance of a flattering edit. And I just think it's just disappointing, because can you imagine like being that close to winning and then watching it on television and getting nothing, despite technically having like really real accomplishments? It's just kind of disappointing to me.
So, I think that now we want to move into a little bit of the legacy of evaluation of who Susie Smith was. And I first, Maggie, want to ask you, I think a lot of our conversation today has centered on Susie being a bit of an enigma, where it seems like there's like a lot to talk about when maybe there like should not be a lot to talk about. But even before you get to all of that, why do you think production ultimately put her on the cast? Why do you think that they chose for her to be a part of Gabon?
I don't know. She was passionate, I guess. But like I for the life of me, like can't, maybe they wanted, because they had a bunch of, sort of kooky characters out there. Like you had people like Randy, who I'm sure during casting was, a hoot. You had people like Crystal, like Kenny, like Sugar, who had incredibly dynamic personalities that popped. And maybe they wanted this, sort of suburban mom character who they thought the audience could resonate with, like she's like, oh, she's like a mom. Like she reminds me of my neighbor. She reminds me of my mom, but then I think that Susie, I don't know, I haven't seen all the footage, but I just wonder if she was unable to bring that dynamic presence to the confessionals that they were looking for. And I don't know. What do you think?
I think that I think you're onto a point here. I also think that production maybe misunderstood Susie or
Yeah.
we're misrating her. Susie is Midwestern. Maggie, you're Midwestern and have
Mhm.
moved out to the coast as someone who is as born and raised on the coasts my whole life, but I have family in the Midwest. I think that there's often cultural differences that are maybe not so obvious, but maybe have us interpret each other a little bit differently. Do you think it's possible that, Survivor, which is LA based, is maybe not fully understanding maybe like the Midwestern roots of Susie and how that plays into who she is?
Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I
I
What
don't
mean,
do you think,
know.
Kev?
I think, well, I just think at the end of the day, we're not particularly great at telling Susie's story, and Susie herself is not great at it either, right? So let's,
Mhm.
I will give them a bit of the benefit of the doubt still. Um, at the end of the day, like we see a lot of parallels between Susie and Sandra, which, makes sense at the end of the day. There's not that many like Latina finalists in general in Survivor. So I get the parallel, but they're also so different. And I don't even mean like their social skills, which I think is the easiest way to kind of think about their
Mhm.
differences. But like, Susie's like rural, she's like, migrant
Sure.
family worker. She's rural. Sandra's urban. Susie's like way older than Sandra. Sandra's like 29 in Pearl Island. Susie's 47. Susie's way older than those people. And I think, Sandra's like so charismatic. She like leads, she commands a room. Susie's feels like
Mhm.
your mom who's like kind of like too overly nurturing, and she's like bringing in hot pockets and be like, or like pizza bagels, and it's like, do you want anything? It's like, mom, leave us alone. Like I felt like so
Mhm.
often Susie's issues that she like, can't read a room, and that she's putting her foot in her mouth because she doesn't understand that she should take a step back or modulate her personality a little bit here and there to get people to like you. And I find that actually kind of endearing, but I can also probably tell like on the island that's not particularly exciting,
Yeah. Or like
I
someone you want to work with, you
Yeah.
know?
Kevin, I think that's a great analogy. Imagining, when Susie was working with the Onion Alliance, they're the cool teens, and Susie's their mom, who's really annoying. But they're like all trapped in just camp, right? Like they can't get away from her. They're on like a one room cabin vacation where they're
Yeah.
stuck with mom, who's not fun.
And every time like Susie speaks, they they're embarrassed by her. They're embarrassed by Susie, and I think that's probably a thing that's maybe not talked enough about, is that they find her kind of cringy and not particularly enjoyable. And it's like, these are people who say the most heinous things. They are so elitist. They're so obnoxious. They all have so many negative qualities that Susie never really kind of speaks that poorly about. But this kind of like nice, unassuming person is the person that they hate. Like Randy's like, Susie yawns too loudly. It's like whatever she does, you're gonna hate. Which I find, it's like maybe that's like a self-reflective exercise you should take a bit too. And so so a lot of people say Susie is like a nothing character, but to me, a character is also like how they shift the story. Like Susie, despite not being the flashy person herself, enrages people around her. She's open to moving the game in directions that are interesting. Like there's actually stuff here. And I think if you think of Susie
Sorry.
like that, it's more fun. Go
Funny.
ahead.
No, it is. That's why I'm cracking up, because it is way more fun to think of her like that. Like she might not pop off the screen, but she's making everybody else around her react so strongly. But I think that that's part of it, is that we as the audience, we're like, why do they feel this way about her? Like, let us in. Susie, show us what you're doing. Like, tell us what you're doing. We want to know. And then she just doesn't. So we're sort of like, what's going on? And
Yeah.
that's why she becomes this sort of enigma, because we see the way everybody's reacting to her and we're like, okay, so show us like why this is happening, and then they never do. So we're all sort of like left scratching our heads a little bit about it. And I do want to make clear that my Sandra comparison, I just mean like within casting. I would assume they're both mothers. Yes, Sandra's 29, but considering the rest of her Pearl Islands cast, she definitely is like the motherly figure. She's the one, they on that very first Pearl Islands episode, she goes in and she's speaking in Spanish and she's collecting all the food and she's, all of this stuff. And, Susie is the one who Crystal's like, mom's got to stick together. I just think that like casting, if you're looking at just like tropes that they cast, I think that they fit sort of the same thing.
Yeah.
They're wildly different people, players, all of that. They both made it to the end of their seasons. They were both effective players, but wildly different. So that's why I made that analogy earlier. I just didn't
Yeah.
want you to think that I was,
Well, I appreciate your clarity, and because I didn't think of anything like that, and anyone, I'm sure most people make the connection between the two of them, right? That's not
Mhm.
abnormal. Um, And I think just the way that you talk about casting, it's like, I'm sure race does play a role in the way that casting sees characters, right? So it's not strange. Like, I'm sure they're like casting thought about Cassandra and Fiji as very similar to Suri, right? And like maybe there's some reductionist elements in that, but I think that doesn't change the reality about how quite often audiences see people, connect people. And this is a podcast about audience receptions, and I think maybe it's another issue that Susie has, is that she feels like a really cheap version of Sandra, but it's also like you're comparing her to the Queen of Survivor. I don't think it's a fair assessment, but it's like she's like,
no one will look good in comparison.
It's so interesting that Susie, who's kind of like a more of a like an unflashy person, is compared to like, she's in a crazy cast of people with really big personalities. She's been compared to like a literal legend of the game. It's like, well, of course, if you take things super literally, she's not very interesting at all. But if you're aware of how interesting that is to be that person in relation to all these other people, I think that's kind of fun. And I choose to have fun when I watch Survivor. So I think that's why I tend to like the Susie Smith experience.
Me too.
Right? More people should have fun watching Survivor. Yeah, that's what I think.
Maggie, I love your framing of the audience spends the season being like, Susie, like, what are you doing to make all these people feel this way, right? Like, show us like what is actually there that is making them have these responses. You have the whole season of that, and I think it's very appropriate that given the arc that Susie has, it is capstoned with Jeff voicing that in the reunion, saying like, what was the deal here? Like, please explain this to me. Like, he was literally in Gabon at all of the tribal councils, and he is also perplexed about like what is happening here. And I think coming into today's podcast, I would not have said that, but I feel like now I can say Susie has a little bit of mystery to her, and I think that that's another way to try to look at this season in a little more fun, right? Like, Susie Smith, mystery woman.
She doesn't
love it.
She like doesn't bathe long enough for people. She yawns too loudly. Like, it's like this weird projection on Susie, who's like the most average normal person ever. But the idea that people just force all these things upon her is just so fascinating to me.
I think the easiest explanation is that for many of the people in Gabon, Susie became that roommate that you hate, and every single thing she does annoys you. And it does not matter if your best friend does the exact same thing. You're totally fine. And as soon as Susie does it, you're like, oh, there she goes again.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, think about as that person, could Susie have done anything after they had that conclusion about her? I don't really know if she could have, because while I think that she put herself in a hole a bit, at the end of the day, those people were not letting her out of that one. Like, I don't think there's anything that she could have done. And actually, I go to their final tribal council statements to Susie, the 4 people that vote for Bob. I think people are so quick to identify the bitterness subjected to Sugar, and clearly there's like very volatile statements that are made to her, but like seemingly do not seem to understand that there's so much bitterness directed towards Susie. And, people say, of course, that Sugar was such a huge factor in Gabon, but the Marcus boot to me is my favorite part of the season, and Sugar's not part of that. So I've always really credited Susie with their dismissal and their kind of eventual, like, kind of unraveling so much more than Sugar, even though I think Sugar technically was more influential, especially in that end game. But, in that final tribal council, Randy goes up and he goes, if 39 days ago you told me that Susie, you'd be over there and I'd be over here, I would tell that person that they were crazy. And I go, 39 days ago, you mean day one, when she had not made actually an impression upon you? You've already think that's strange and weird. Yeah. I think that's interesting. And he says that like multiple times you said that you felt sorry for me. Could you elaborate on that? And then pauses and goes, and elaborate means to, and I'm like, Susie knows what elaborate means. Like, I think quite often we keep hearing that Susie is dumb or unintelligent. And I don't think she's particularly articulate, but that's not the same as being intelligent, right? Like there are different things here. Charlie asks the juror, the finalists about, he references the ranking in right before they swapped. And he goes, when we did that ranking, Susie, you were ranked last for your tribe and Sugar second to last for yours. So can you convince us why we should change our impression of you now that we're doing a new peer assessment? Which I think is, like, in general, doesn't seem like a very difficult question at all. But I think inside of that, it takes the literal interpretation of that ranking, which is quite often about challenge performance, which of course men will be ranked higher than women, right? Like every woman was ranked low, even Crystal, who, doping or not, people dope and can't get into the Olympics, by the way, is ranked like below Randy of all people. Like there's clearly, like, I feel like there's just like they're coming in with a very distinct idea of like how Susie and Sugar also should have played the game, that I find like really unfair. Marcus says that like, Susie, you came to Gabon as a mother and a child educator, but you sacrificed all of that to not be a good role model in life. And I'm like, well, what did she do that was so bad? Like, was the yawning that bad? Like, I can't imagine. Like, what the problem you have is that she chose to like stick up for herself. And I kind of love the idea that people like Susie are sticking up for themselves when clearly it's not the cool thing to do or the best thing for your game. But I'm obviously in the tank for Susie. So what do I have to say?
I think that something that production could have done to give the audience maybe a better view of Susie without doing anything to change her character was just to add in some dodo music around the onions here and there. When you have them, making the comments about Susie, when you have them being really elitist, I think if you add a little more music cues to them, I think that you start to have like a better perspective, because the onions really do have very, very strong opinions about someone that does not seem to do all that much on camera. But I think they really are depicted as like authority figures who are approaching the game very thoughtfully. And I think that around that time in Survivor, we're just coming off of Micro, where there's so much of, I think, excitement about the strategy and like machinations in gameplay that I think that people were probably excited for that. Do you think that that's a fair view of how people were coming into Gabon? Like high on the strategic supply that they had just gotten.
That's strategic, and also like the Black Widow Brigade was full of charismatic people, really good in confessional, and Susie's like none of those things. So I think the producers who were like on site were like, well, we're gonna drive our attention towards these other people, and so like I'm sure when Susie was the producer that was with Susie as Susie was talking was probably not giving her the best questions either, just because they've already kind of checked out. They don't really care, and I think Susie continually defied all those odds. And then I think it's like there's a story that exists here, right? That it's like, you could have easily just had Corinne talking about how Susie's so stupid and then show footage of Susie beating her at a challenge. You could have done so many of these little pieces, sound effects and things that could have made us like root for Susie as an underdog, but we don't even see her as one.
I think probably they would have done that if she was the winner.
Yeah.
Like but they had to edit the story of like, she almost won, but she didn't, So I think that
but I don't think they even give her the story that she almost won, right? Per Jeff's even his comments. And so I think they're in a bit of a bind. But I think there's been runners up who have gotten more flattering edits despite being less close to the win. So it's like, I just don't think it's that out of the popular imagination to like have a few things. I'm sure like there was at least one moment where someone laughed at Susie's joke. I'm sure there was one moment where like people are like, what, Susie's like nice. I really like Susie. And like, we don't see any of those things. And I think that also like, affects how people think about things. And I'm sure Susie in the collective consciousness in Survivor, Gabon's a season a lot of people can skip. And I think it's crap, but I think it's something that people do because all the returnees don't go very far. It's just kind of like Fiji. Like, why would you, if 40 seasons is a lot, 43 now. So if you're trying to like watch them all, Gabon's something you can skip often. And actually what I wanted to say earlier in that popularity poll is that Susie is most correlated to liking Gabon. So Susie and Crystal both tied that if you like them, you're far more likely to like Gabon. If you hate them, you're more likely to hate Gabon. So it's like, to me, if you hate Susie and Crystal, you hate irony. And therefore, you probably have bad Survivor opinions. I'm sorry. I'm just going to say it.
So, Maggie, at the end of this conversation, this lovely journey that we've had about Susie, do you think that Susie was robbed?
No, but it's because of my love of Suri. And I think that Susie lost in a final tribal, which is a mechanism of the game. So no. But I do think that there are things Susie could have done that would have made her game a winning game. Like, I don't think her game was never possible for her to win. I think that with some adjustments here and there, socially, mostly, she could have been a Survivor winner.
Fair.
What are your thoughts?
At the end of the day, I don't think Susie's robbed. I think she's robbed in like the edit. I think that's undeniable to me. I just think it's that hard to give her like a little bit more. But yeah, she's not robbed by any real like definition that you would use. So
Yeah. In your
you
heart.
know, in my
God's
heart,
in your heart. Mhm.
and I feel the need, and I think that's actually, it's so much more fun to be a Susie fan than a Susie hater, in my opinion, right? Because to be a Susie fan is just like, you get to imagine a whole different world that no one else seems to understand and live on that plane, right? And it's just, I love Susie, and I feel the need to stick up for Susie because I feel like the Susies quite often are not respected in Survivor, but also in life. And something that drew me to Survivor is the fact that there's so many parallels to our actual world. And Gabon's, when I'm in high school, starting to be aware of like clickiness, stratification, condescension from like elites, and I felt like Gabon had all of that, and it felt it would have been so perfect for Susie to get the last laugh at the end about all these people from all these different backgrounds, and especially the white collar ones, look down on her, and to see her defeat them at the very end, to everyone's surprise, including Jeff Probst. I would have lived, but it didn't happen. So I will live in my own mind, in my own fantasy about it. But I guess technically Susie Smith was not robbed. Nige?
Yeah, go by any technical definition. No, I think I am, after having this conversation, more bullish on her chances as a winner. I think I have been a little more convinced that she is capable of winning if she were to come back, depending on the crew that she's with, clearly. But I'm fully in the camp of she's robbed to me, in my delusion, in my universe. I'm totally on board.
Yeah. Well, are there any final thoughts on Susie, or do you think we've talked a lot about Susie for a character that doesn't talk a lot herself? I mean, in the edit, apparently she talks all the time. We barely see it until the finale. Do you think there's any final like thoughts on Susie, or maybe better ways to appreciate her character in general?
I mean, I think that if you go into Gabon and consider I think like the facts on the ground of like what Susie's outing was. And I think that if you just look at the edit as being unflattering to her and thinking about, well, what would a more flattering depiction look like? I think it's actually very easy to see how you could have a more flattering Susie Smith on Survivor. But I think that, in a cast of crazy people, I think that she's a really fun, normal person dropped in there. And I think that in itself is always a fun experience. What about you, Maggie? Any final thoughts on Susie Gabon in general?
You got to watch Gabon if you haven't. I mean, if you've made it this far in the podcast and you haven't watched Gabon, I'm so confused, but thank you.
Just do it.
But I mean, we really went in the weeds on Gabon here. But I mean, Gabon's such a fun ride. Once you get it, like if you go in ready to have fun, ready to have a good time, don't take life so seriously. Don't take Survivor so seriously. Like go on the ride. It's great. It's so fun. And yeah, then you get to have these great fun conversations where, you're making just like a normal point and then everybody starts giggling because it's so funny because it's Susie. It's great. It's so fun.
Kev, closing thoughts?
Closing thoughts on I will say that at the end of this pod, all Susie Smith's fans should unite, all 12 of us, who are really holding the fort down.
Of us here. Yeah.
Yes. That at the end of the day, I think the fun of Susie is just like with Gabon, it's you're flipping things on its head. And I think it's fun to have that thought experiment. I think if you go and watch Survivor and think of it as like a very simplistic formula that you should be good at challenges, it's very much the final tribal council format today, where they go through all 3 steps and check all these boxes about like being good at outwit, outplay, outlast. If you think about it in those ways, I don't think Survivor is nearly as compelling. I like the idea that people from different walks of life can succeed, and that means people who are a little basic and not particularly the most exciting television can also do that and also create exciting television. Just kind of gives you so much wonder and so much possibility. And I love to see people kind of think more critically about Survivor, especially when it comes to Gabon, where we're spoon-fed an idea that Susie is dumb, weak, crazy, but I don't really think she's technically any of those things. I think at most she's not cool. She's not particularly funny, but those are not the things that were being said about her. And so if you kind of like use Gabon as a way to kind of like explore, I think, the complexity of characters, even someone as small of an edit as Susie, I think you'll be better served. And definitely watch Gabon when you get the chance. It's a great season. So I love that we were able to do this today.
Well, Maggie, thank you so much for joining us on this journey to talk about the flashiest person that has ever been on Survivor. Do you have anything coming up that you want to promote?
Yeah, so Jacob and I are right now doing the Real Housewives of Salt Lake City wrap up. It's every couple of weeks here we go through what's going on Salt Lake City. We're almost at the end of the season, so check that out if you haven't. And if you don't watch and you just want to listen to Jacob and I talk for an hour and a half, you don't need to. You don't need to watch. You can just come. We'll explain you. We'll walk you through it. So yeah, check those out if you haven't already. And you can find me on Instagram at @MLMorgan_. I'm not on Twitter. So if you disagree with my hot takes here, shout into the void because I won't see it.
Love that. Kevin, what do we have coming up?
So You Thought You Knew only has one more episode left of our season, and it will be on You Thought You Knew Tom Westman. So we'll be talking about someone who is also an immunity beast, just like Susie Smith is, by the way. Also, does very well with juries. And so Tom will be really exciting to talk about. And so we'll be doing that next week. And if you want to follow me, you can follow me at Asian Narc on Twitter, which is short for my Instagram handle at Asian Narcissist. Nige, where can people find you?
You can find me on Twitter at Nigel Speed. Thank you for listening, everybody. We hope to see you again next week to talk about the Tom Westman. Have a good one.